This is our first online meetup. We usually organize meetups in the office, but since we have a very unusual situation, so we can only host online meetups right now. My name is Maciej. For those who don't know me, I'm a talent acquisition specialist at Gravity 9. We're a small consulting company. We help our clients to transform we provide digital solutions to our clients using latest technologies. We have a small team in Poland, software development team that is based in Krakow, and we have some other part of the Gravity 9 team in the UK. And Noel will be talking today about Azure APIs. And so maybe Noel, you can introduce yourself and tell everyone more about Gravity 9 and about today's meetup. This is, I think this is scheduled for about 1 hour, maybe an hour and a half. Am I right?
Yeah, we should be good for about an hour.
Okay. So there's going to be also, I suppose there's going to be some time for questions at the end of your presentation, right? So if you guys feel like asking a question, use the chat box, please, on the right-hand side. Okay, so over to you, Noel.
Okay. Thanks, Maciej. Thanks, everyone. I'll start off. So today I just wanted to go through talking through the Azure Management API. So what I've got is a little bit of a presentation. So we'll just talk through some of the guiding principles or logical, theoretical side of the API, and then we're going to jump into a bit of a demo, and I'll show you some bits and pieces around the gateway service or the API management service. So yeah, I'll get cracking. Hopefully I should be able to share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Let's just get through some of this stuff then. Okay, cool. Yeah, so like I said, I will be talking that way. I'll be talking a little bit about a few things, but so we're going to go through basically what is an API, and apologies for anyone who's, I'm sure everyone on the call has either created an API or used an API, but I'm just going to go do a little bit of background around theory and general advantages and approaches for APIs, and then some of the benefits. Then we'll talk about the nuts and bolts inside of API management. We'll look about we're going to be using something called Swagger, which is a description language, and how that kind of fits in with API management. But then also we'll talk about some of the features within the management. There's quite a lot of, I would say, rich out the box and configurable features that gives you a lot of power from just a starting point. I will, so just to, I know Maciej gave you an introduction to me, so thanks, Maciej. So I'm I guess a technical consultant. I've been an engineer for maybe 22 years, 23 years. I've been a consultant and working on lots of different projects, and then we generated Gravity, or we built Gravity out of the concept of bringing quite small, highly experienced teams together in order to build quite complex and large solutions. So we develop and we build digital solutions, and a big part of what we do is putting together digital solutions, whether that's a UI driven solution that's targeted at the general public, or if it's an application that runs in an enterprise. We tend to build a lot of web front end applications and mobile, but our core, I would say, our core foundation is around microservice development design, and so API management is a big part of what we kind of do on most of our larger projects. We do also do some of the UI side of that as well, of UX and design, but I'd say our core is engineering. So that kind of leads us into, you know, as a company, we spend a lot of time working with systems, APIs and applications. And so I'm just going to run through a lot around applications and APIs in general. So close your ears and have a cup of tea if you've gone through this before, but it's quite basic stuff. So So basically, API is what's an API. Just to call that out explicitly, we're talking about an application programming interface, where an application is something that runs as a set of logical elements of code. It's usually to do something quite useful for either business, personal, or something. So there's some running logic somewhere that's implemented through a programming language usually. The programming pieces allow us to interact with the computer, to instruct it to do some stuff. No surprises there. And an interface really is a way for us to interact with that kind of blob of logic, if you like. So it's quite important to call that out. I think the main advantage, and again, this is going back to the fundamentals and the specifics around APIs. I know this is bread and butter stuff for most developers these days, but just to call it out, I think any time in our industry that something works from top to bottom, as in works from the very low level to the very high level, like a service bus on a motherboard can be a service bus in an enterprise. It generally suggests that those kind of patterns and practices and approaches are specific, reusable, and useful. So we rely on those things that make sense at all levels of granularity. And I believe an API is that same thing. So we can have an API at different levels of granularity. Whether that's at a low-level piece of code or a library, or whether that's at an enterprise kind of service definition talking to a set of systems on the back end. APIs give us a number of different things. One advantage, I guess, is the simplification. So as opposed to working with a large, I guess, monolithic or complex piece of code or object-oriented map or graph of objects, sometimes it's quite nice to simplify that interface as a consumer of that code, to be able to talk through some interfaces a little more intentful. So as opposed to working from an object model, you might work with a small set of methods that allow you to do the same thing. So obvious stuff, but it's important to call that stuff out. Secure, the idea of having interaction and reducing I would say the touch point of code or systems or applications. So when we talk about interfaces, we can apply security at that kind of perimeter level, more specific to APIs. You can switch your security context. So you might be working or wrapping up an old technology on the back end that maybe works with some older technology and potentially not as secure mechanisms that you wouldn't want to expose to the outside world. Sometimes an interface is a good way of kind of perimeterizing that and providing a modern and secure approach to accessing your internal systems. So it's generally a good advantage. Integration. I mean, we want to integrate. We want to talk between systems, and when we have interfaces, it just makes our job so much easier. So installation is a good selling point of an API. Generally, I think of facades when I think of interfaces and installation. So that ability to insulate what's behind your API is super powerful, especially in an organization or a larger organization. But even if you're just building an application and you have consumers that need information or want to put information to your system, exposing clearly defined and well thought through APIs becomes a nice layer of almost protection against your internal changes. So, whether you're an organization or exposing your systems and services digitally through APIs, or if you're just providing an application, your internal workings are kind of agnostic to the rest of the world, and that gives you quite a lot of control and insulation. You can change and evolve internally while the outside world isn't affected. And I guess then I see reuse as generally in development and programming languages and code, we can reuse most things, but it's what is reused is important here. So I think implementing interfaces and building solutions to interfaces gives you all those above advantages, and as a result you get a reuse. Reuse doesn't come just from having something that you can reuse, it's something that's accessible, that's secure, gives you something for free every time you use it, and that's absolutely what we're trying to do with APIs. That's what we do a lot with our API gateway implementations with our clients, is to give them a one-time implementation build for an access point. So whether you're building for your first mobile application or your web application, and then you can use the same endpoints for your Alexa app or your internal applications that want to talk to those systems as well. So you kind of get to reuse everything that's behind an API if you build it in the right way, and you make it, and you apply the appropriate best practice to make it attractive to reuse, and you get something for free. So just I don't want to stay too theoretical because we've got quite a lot to get through on the API, but again, there is a bit of a history to this. I've kind of lived through some of this, not all of it. There's interfaces have been around for a long time. We had early systems that were relatively difficult and challenging to build with regards to things like punch cards in the 70s, and then as technologies moved on, object-oriented programming kind of enhanced and took the idea of an interface to another level, and reusability and abstraction installation comes as part of that kind of interface. So I mean, pure interfaces in like .NET or Java or C, you'll be used to using those components, and those came in. That reusability started to see more rapid application development, and this is how it's evolving through services. So now we're seeing cleaner, more defined, more specific APIs being built for the purpose of reuse, not just because I've got a UI that's JavaScript and I've got a back end, but actually I want a back end that I can really leverage and pull into lots of different projects and basically save money, reuse, and reduce risk. ESBs were a good example of that, although I would say an early version of microservices, in that they were a little, I won't say monolithic, but it was quite centralized. The idea was around orchestration of services, all quite RPC approached, but microservice feels like an iteration on top of that. So that's kind of where we are today. We use lots of services and expose our microservices behind an API gateway. We have then internal benefits of abstraction, all the rest of it. So that's the kind of the world we're in now. You'd expect that at some point it'll evolve from microservices to something hopefully even more flexible. But I feel like where we are today is a good place. It sits on the back of these previous generations that we've learned from. Just the whole decoupling, the one of the I think the hardest things in designing services is the granularity, and microservices I think helps you get to a good level of granularity in my experience and what I've seen. So working with, I'm a big fan of domain-driven design, and that idea of a bounded context mapped to a microservice is at least a starting point is actually quite a nice place for you to start. It feels like a good place to start, and maybe you go down to an aggregate root sort of level where it's a bit more specific to just a customer and you get more fine-grained microservices. We're going to focus very much on the web UI part of services, even though services today are obviously a little more asynchronous and would use messaging in between them to be decoupled. API gateway is very centric around the request response kind of model for a service, and keep things very simple. And I think purposely, because if you start to expose your services to the world, even the smallest pieces of complexity start to cause problems with your consumers. Don't underestimate, or in my experience, I've learned not to underestimate how even just a small or relatively non-clear and unspecific endpoint can cause confusion on the consumer side. So I tend to try and build services that are very explicit, very clean, very small in their payloads, in order to be able to give the consumer a very clear direction as to what that service is, what it's responsible for, and how to interact with it. And if you're an enterprise and you're exposing your services out to partners and customers and clients and even your internal people, you don't want to have to spend time having to explain in detail the various services. So I guess just to call out really. Okay, so that's the basics over and done with. So we talked a little bit around APIs, why they're important, why they're useful, and so we're looking at API management within the Azure platform. So it provides I would say quite a few things, but one of the most important things to me, and one of the things that you talk to, that people come to talk to us about is really, okay, this is a nice way of putting that parameter kind of security on your services. So we can stand up a service, we can put it into an open kind of environment like Azure and open it up to the world, but actually having something that stands in front of it seems to be the very first thing that people resonate to. Actually be quite nice to have some protection around that service, not only from authentication, but also from protection of someone hitting that or trying to bring that service down. there's all sorts of mechanisms around API management that can help you alleviate some of those risks. So just a quick overview of what it is. It's very, I guess, 10,000 foot description. API management is it's a service out of Azure. It's subscription based, so a SaaS model. And it's three main components. There's obviously quite a few moving pieces to it and highly configurable, but generally speaking, there's three kind of core components to the offering. Service administration is kind of the area and the portal that you would manage the API. And so that is a place where you would administer, add, and manipulate your service and service descriptions. If anyone does have any burning questions or issues when I'm talking, please just sort of message it up, and I'm sure Mesha will prod me. Yeah, so that's where we would edit the services. That's like a management portal for those services and how we see them. We can also interact with that via an API itself. So there's a management API that allows us to manipulate that service. I'll talk a little bit about that. I don't use that in this demo just because it takes a little more setting up than I think would be appropriate for an hour or two's chat. But so the second piece is the developer portal, which is another very interesting and useful component to the service. It's another thing that you get that you wouldn't, if you were exposing or building this thing yourself or pulling a few things together. You can do the same sort of thing with some open source tools around API management. But the developer portal is an area that you can, through permission-based and role-based security, allocate or invite people to the portal in order to start not only be able to see and understand what your services look like, but also test and interact with them. And so that's a very powerful kind of environment to be able to switch up exposure services and invite other developers and partners to come and actually interact with, whether it's a production ready API or whether you're exposing your test services. It gives all full guidance, and we'll go into this a little bit later, but that's quite a powerful kind of environment. And the last thing is really like the gateway itself, which is effectively like the runtime for API management. The gateway basically is the endpoint, the HTTP listener, if you like, that's listening on the web. It's a public IP, and as traffic runs through that API gateway, anything you've managed, you've configured through the policy management is then applied to that traffic. And we'll go into this a little bit later as to how we do that and segment some of the rules and work out how we apply different rules for different traffic. And who's doing it or how it's organized. But those are the three kind of main components. Makes sense. We'll touch each of them. So we'll go through as we go through. It's just a little bit of a call out on some of the, I guess, the static configuration or the fundamental configuration for the product. So basically, we've got this idea of users and groups. So users can be invited to the portal, as in developers generally. So you would invite a developer to come and interact with your API. It will show the APIs, it will document them, and it will allow them to interact with them and test with them. So they can then replicate the same in their applications and work with them from code. Those users are generally added to a group of users, which again comes down to permissions. The API side of things, generally speaking, we import, or we tend to we don't build our APIs inside the portal. The gateway API management is obviously more of a pass through of traffic to your services, so it's more of a perimeter service that sits in front of your services. But we do import them in and describe our services at this perimeter level, and then within the portal we can configure the various APIs that you've imported and place those into different products. So the reason why you would want to do that is one, for example, you might have an API that's provides information about your customers, and you might have another API that's I don't know, whatever your business model is around sales. You might have a separate kind of broken out API, and you can kind of segment those APIs, but you can also group them into products. Now, products you can use for different purposes, but one common approach is to use a product for your, almost like your tiering for services. So for example, if you expose a service for customers, or if you were Twitter and you exposed services for your tweets, for example, you might have a product that's like a free product, and that product you can associate to an API, and then you can associate a group of users to that API, and then say, okay, we'll come and use this for free. There's a product here that you can use to gain access to your tweet, for example, or your friend's tweets, whatever the scenario. But that product might have certain restrictions. If you're giving it away free, you probably don't want full throughput. You don't want them to be able to run 100,000 messages a second. You know, you want to probably rate them to something like 100 a day or something. I don't know, whatever you think is appropriate for a free service. And so that's one way of using products to be able to kind of tier out your offerings of your APIs. So it almost becomes a workshop. And there's other reasons why you would have different tiers. It's not just around rates. It might be around security, and a whole host of other reasons why you might want to segment your services out. But yeah, so that's quite a powerful feature and simple to use within the portal. Yeah, and then so once you're in inside once you have an API, and we'll go through some of these things in a moment. The mechanism and the full use of the gateway really is that you get traffic come into your service and it will come back out again. So there's 3 or there's 4 core what are called policies that you can apply to your requests that come through your API gateway. And you can set these rules or these policy elements at different levels. So you can do it at a global level. So any request that ever comes in, maybe you want to strip off the response header and not expose to any consumers that are consumer IP. You might not want to give away what technology you're using on the back end. So all those HTTP headers, you might want to strip those off. You might then, for a specific API, want to put different rules for your inbound traffic. So you might want to check, do some JOT validation around, okay, is this person validated? Do I have an access token? And so all sorts of different reasons why you might want to do different things. I want to look at a few of the different policies, but just to say that the life cycle is ultimately traffic comes into the portal. You have 2 places before it gets to the backend service, and your backend service being your implementation, product or system app service in Azure. Whether that's a Docker container, whatever it is, it's something's running, and that's what you're pointing to eventually. So before it gets to routing that, it will do an inbound. So that's the first thing. As soon as it receives a response, you can do some checks. Once you've done those checks, it will push it down to the back end, and you might want to do some rerouting on the back end to send it to different services based on some logic. And then on the way back out, again, you can apply different traffic rules on the way out as well. So again, we'll have a look at these things in a minute, but they're the policy areas you get to hook into, if you like, but you can do those at different levels, so it gives you quite a lot of power. Oops, sorry. Okay, and then policy scope. Yes, this is really what I was talking about. You can apply those different policies at different levels, so you can have a broad policy, which you might want to check a JOT validation on every single request that ever comes in, or you might want to do that at the product level. We might do it at the API, and then you can go right down to the operation level. So, and we'll show a few examples of where you might want to do different things in just a second. We'll just have a look at vision. So obviously a big piece of APIs and API management and control over time is the ability to have new versions of an API and also revisions. So we'll look at these a little bit. Just a high level. A version is very much, this is a new version, a full version of the API that was previously available. So it's almost like a new endpoint, and a revision is a change to that. So there's mechanisms within the product that allow you to iterate your existing version, make some tweaks, test those tweaks before you kind of push it out there and hold the config, the change log for those changes as you iterate. So we'll look at those. Yeah, okay. So that's the screen bit done. We're going to have a little look at the code now. That sounds, if I can move my, okay, cool. I know I've been waffling for a bit, so if anyone wants to jump up, if there's any questions, just shout out now while I'm getting ready if any of that wasn't clear. What I'm going to do now is just basically show you, I've got quite a simple API that sits, this is a .NET Core web API, just a simple MVC application. I don't, if there's programmers amongst you, it's really just a mechanism for, sorry, if they're not programmers amongst you, it's really just a way of building an application a bit like a web application. It just has no front end. And what we're doing here is we're interested in exposing some logic on our back end through some JSON or web kind of endpoints. So kind of RESTful implementation in a small application. So this is an application that is providing some information around just our use case, which is consultancy. So we have a number of different consultants at Gravity 9, and we all have different skills. So we just put a little bit of logic around that, just expose a few pieces around that, so you can get a list of all of our consultants. We can see who's currently available, and then we can create a new skill, which is an endpoint. Quite simple. We've got another thing here that we're going to switch on a bit later, but I'll talk to you that in just a second. So yeah, just say it's quite simple. The only thing is quite vanilla, isn't it? There's not much in the way of logic here. It's just a very, very simple. I've got a consultant store, which is just an in-memory set of consultant information that sits in my I just got unlock service there, and really it's just a set of people and their skills. So it's not doing much. The one thing I have done is there's a product or a library that you might want to look at called NSwag, which is basically just a nice way of being able to describe your services without doing too much. So you can add once you've imported NSwag, you can add an open API document in your startup and basically describe a little bit of the description around the API, the Swagger endpoint. And then there's a couple of just inlines there to add to your code. But what that does is give you quite a nice, I'll show you this running locally and then we'll deploy it. So if you have, so if you have that library implemented, a few lines of code with that, it gives you this Swagger endpoint. So this just comes on top of your API your API application. There's no, it kind of just picks up. It uses some reflection to do this. And I've got one controller. It's picked up that, and then it's got 3 methods that I've allowed that I've built on the end of that. And then so I've got an API where I've got all my consultants. So if I can get in there and I can actually run this stuff. So yeah, I've got a JSON array coming back. It's just a JSON endpoint, and I can do that for all my different endpoints on that application. So that's the application. Hopefully it makes sense. It's not really doing too much. Oops. So I have actually just deployed this, so it's gone up to Azure, and it's running as an app service, so keeping it quite simple. I'll show you some stuff in Azure. So it's this app service running here. I've got an endpoint. I should be able to navigate to this, hopefully. So yeah, that's the same application. It's just running as an app service in Azure, so it's publicly available. And so I guess, if you were building an API and you wanted a quick push out, obviously that's some code. I mean, you probably want to wrap a little more around protecting it internally, but it's a working application, and you could expose that. So, so why would we want to sort of introduce API management? Well, I guess like we were talking about earlier, some of the biggest benefits around security and perimeter kind of control, and who can see what and do what. So we're going to just do some stuff, and we're going to configure this service up in API management, and I'll show you a few different policies that we can work with. So I'm just going to okay. So yeah, let's go across. So we've got, so basically we can come here, and I'll come back to this in a second, this endpoint. Everything I'm doing in the demo is manual. There is everything I do, and everything I do in the API management kind of portal, you can do via the API. And actually, there's quite a few out-of-the-box components that you can pull into Azure DevOps. So you can build them into build pipelines and deploy pipelines so that your API management gateway, with the things that people see on the development portal are in line with obviously your deployed code, and you don't need to go through this manual step, but obviously that's not particularly good for a demo. So I'll just skip back to, so API management. So if you're in Azure, its API management is the service description or the service type. And you'll have a running version of that once you set it up. It can take a little while to set it up. So one thing to, I guess, point out on the management API, it is quite a well distributed product out of the box, even with the lower tier. It's it's very resilient. So it is it's not, you don't get one instance. It's kind of a well distributed, I would say, well architected product. It's got to be capable of managing hundreds of thousands of requests. So it's quite well architected into the covers. As a result, when you do build it, it can take up to 20 minutes to get that API management ready. So just, don't worry if you start it and it does take a little while. It can take a while because it has to set up across a couple of, if not regions, at least physical boxes across the data center you set it up in. I think they try and make sure that it goes across two regions with, two data centers at least in the same region. Okay, so this is the management services portal. I haven't got much in here. I've actually deleted all the APIs that were in here. So the first thing we probably want to do, and we can go through some of these things, but the overview, this blade is just standard Azure stuff, so I won't spend much time on that. But where we will spend some time is around here. So these are APIs. These are the actual configured APIs that we're going to point back to. Products are the things we were talking about earlier. So we might create a free product. We might create a different type of product, a free product and a full product. So we'll be working in their name values. We won't touch too much, but they're effectively placeholders. So there's lots of places, and we'll show you a bit later, where you can configure policies. And some policies are based on like templated values. So you might, you might want to set a parameter on your name value pair there, and then you can just refer that to its name and the value will pull through. So that's kind of templating model. That's quite useful to be able to, like for things like versioning, or if you're pointing back to different services for URLs, it's useful for those things. I won't go into everything. We'll go into some security stuff here. We'll talk about OAuth2, and then I won't touch some of the configuration stuff, but obviously you can do a fair bit of configuration, setting up your own DNS. You can set cause information on this stuff. So it's a running external web endpoint. So let's go and create this API. So we've got no APIs right now. I'm going to go and I'm using the Open API on my endpoint. Swagger is part of that standard. So in order to do that, there's a number of ways of doing it. You can download a file, you can point to a Swagger description, or if you're doing it through an API, you would do this in your pipeline. I'm just going to grab the Swagger. Oops. Right. I'm going to try and grab the Swagger. So I'm going to take that URL, and I'll go over to back in here. And then it should pick up. So if we paste, we'll paste that into here. We'll go into this full view of setting up a new endpoint. So it's picked up already. It's kind of looked at the endpoint. It's found that this thing through my description in my application is called Consultants API, and this consultant has given it a name with a dash through. One thing that I tend to do is version everything. So I'm going to call this version 1. There's different ways of setting your scheme. Or your way of segmenting versions. So I tend to use a path. So like there'll be a base address for the API gateway, and then a path for your service name, and then you'll have v1, and then consultants dot the rest of that address. Or you can use a header, or you can use a query string, but it just feels very natural to use the path. Okay, so if we create that, hopefully. We'll see our application or our service pulled into API management. So now we've got this description. I've got Star News bashing around here. consultants API that's been pulled from my description, and then I've got a version 1 of that. And then version 1, you can see I've got a post there, which is in my controller. I've got consultants get, I've got consultants available. So we haven't got much more than we had just looking at the Swagger, but we've got it imported into our portal. And now at this point, we haven't exposed this to anyone. It's not available. It's really just running as a, it's just configured in the into the portal itself. So we've got it described. So the next thing I do is just expose it through the use of groups and products. So if we come into what should we create this? So I'm going to create a couple of products. So let's just do a free product of our endpoint. And then, so there's a couple of things, you can give that a description, and this, we'll see this show up later on when we go into the developer portal. So these things might be useful for you to be setting. Now, the other thing is requires approval. So we're going to set these products up, and we're going to allow people to come and use those products and the APIs that sit under them in different ways. And so as people come into as we invite people to the portal, they'll see a list of products. And they will ask to subscribe to those things. Now, some APIs you might just want to allow and let it run through, like your free product. You might just want to let them subscribe to it, and with no approval step on the back end. But some you might want to. So basically, this is just saying if you require approval. I tend to do that on all of my APIs, and then you can limit how many subscribers go to that particular thing. So it's a kind of a way of limiting who can use it. And then select API. This is where we can select one or more APIs that fall within that product. So remember, we can reuse our APIs. So I can expose my consultants API. I can expose that as a free product, and we'll decorate that product with some restrictions. But I can also use that same API and expose that as a full product where, and because the concern for the API management isn't necessarily what the service does, it's really the throughput of getting to that service. So we're more interested in things like traffic rating and that kind of thing. So yeah, we fully reuse every API we got, and we just expose it in different ways through products. So I'll create that. Now, the other thing we do is I'm going to set up a group, and I'm just going to call it G9 developers. A description there. I've already got it. All right, I'll just call it G9 then. So I'll create a new group there. Actually, while I'm at it, I'll just do everything on the free group, and then I'll show you how it kind of we can change it. Okay, so let's create a group, and now we can go down to some our users. So I'm going to invite a user. I'm just going to invite my and so there's the service itself is evolving. So there's two portals. We'll see the portal in a minute, but I use the legacy portal for now because it's just got everything out of the box. I don't need to do anything. I've just stood this up. But if I was building something for production now for a client, I'd probably use the developer portal. It's a bit more of I don't know, think of it as a fully configurable website, if you like. So you can brand, you can put your logo up, you can change the colors, you can change like descriptions and forms as to how you interact with your API. So it's quite powerful, but it just takes some time to set up. So I'm not going to use it today. Okay, so basically I'm just going to invite that user to that group. And then if I look at my products, I've got a free product. There we go. So I've got access control, and then I want to allow that group. So basically, I've got a group called G9. I've got a product called free, and then I want to allow anyone who's in the G9 group to get access to my free product. Okay. So that should now, unless I've missed a step, that should allow us then to, oops, sorry. I'm just going to open up the developer portal. So this is out of the box. So you can configure this version also. This is the older version, and you can change obviously colors and stuff. But it's just not as it's not as flexible as a newer one. But the newer one takes a little more work, as I said, to get up and running. But you get the kind of principle. Basically, you're going to invite people to your developer portal, and then they'll be able to log in, be able to do different things. Actually, I'm an administrator because I'm logged in as your board, so I've just used that. But I've just sent an invite out to my Hotmail account, and then there'll be a simple follow this link, set your password, and you'll be able to get into the account. Let's just see if I can see that come through. Okay, we'll just use this one. It takes a few minutes to come through. That's the only reason I'm not using the Hotmail, but it must be on there. But so once you've come to the portal and you're logged in, you can either go and look at a list of APIs that are available to you, or you can go and look at a list of products that are available to you. So there's a couple of products out of the box that Microsoft has put into the API management, but I've created this product free, and then you can see that you've got within that product, I've got consultants API, and so I'm going to add subscription to that. To free, yeah. And so now I've got this this kind of portal which gives me the ability to access that product. And so the API management gateway gives you access, and it gives you a very slim mechanism for identification, which is in the form of a subscription key. So basically, you use that subscription key to gain access. It's kind of a lightweight security mechanism. It's a key that you can regenerate yourself, so you can self-manage these things. But you can't call the API endpoint unless you explicitly say when you're setting the service up, you can't call it without that key if you've configured it to use a key. Now, you can open it up and not require a key, but if you do that, you don't get some of the goodness around the analytics and who's calling your services. So generally speaking, I always leave those subscription keys on so that people can, so we can see who's using the API. And so if by user, you can see who's sort of logging in, who's using your endpoints. But yeah, so that who owns that subscription effectively. So I've got, so I've got a number of keys for I've subscribed to the starter and the unlimited and the free. For some reason now, I don't know what I've done. I think it's from a previous, it's because I'm in as the administrator and I haven't actually had to go and request access to the subscription. But usually you would say, I want to subscribe to that one, and then someone in the back end would approve it. Anyway, once it's approved, you can either get to your APIs either directly from the APIs list there, or if you go to products, it'll just list them out. I'm interested in this consultants API endpoint. So basically, we've now exposed this, and probably what I would do at this point, or would have done before now, is close out my service running on the back end. So I've got an app service that's sort of the engine behind all of this. I've got an app service where I can when I call this thing, there's a back-end service supporting it. And hopefully if we do this, so we can see when I go into a particular method in the API, it gives me some information around that. It's always going to set my subscription key, so I can use the different ones that it's given me. And then you can see whatever it's passing out here. So we'll go into a little bit of this later on when we append some different policies. But if I just do a send there, we should see actually, so that's gone out. This was the example request. And then as a result, obviously that's done a pushback to my API, and then I've got some data coming back, which isn't marvelous because we could already do that. But now we've got this. Now we've got this service running in API Gateway. It's being sourced by a service on the back end. What I was about to say was that I would probably lock up my API at this point. So rather than have that still open as an endpoint that people can reach, generally I would IP lock it to the public address on the gateway. So basically the only thing that can call that service outside of the internals of Azure is the API gateway. So it kind of puts a little bit of a perimeter around even accessing that endpoint on your public app service. There's different ways of doing that. Some are more expensive than others. Whitelisting is quite a quick way of doing it. So if you've got a public IP on your API gateway and then you whitelist that on your app service, that gives you that tight close close. If you're using like Azure service environments, those types of like slightly more heavyweight kind of implementations, and you have more control over the perimeter of your services, you can control it through that as well. And you can actually incorporate your app service into that app service environment. So I guess there's some options around that, depending on how much kind of money you want to spend. It does get quite expensive quick. Okay, so that's an example of just getting the basics up and running. So now we've got this, we can start inviting people to our APIs. What I'm going to do now is just say, well, actually, I've got a free product. I don't want that open-ended. If I've got, a number of people come and use my APIs, I'm not charging anything for it. Obviously, that throughput I'm going to pay for. So I'm going to come into my free products. And this is where we can start configuring this product level. So we're not down at the API and we're not up at global. We're kind of we're just looking at, well, if someone's interacting through this product, that's what they subscribe to. We can put some rules around that now. So policies are the way to do that. And this is a little bit old school in a way from XML, but it's also quite flexible and makes sense. There is a graphical point on the API endpoint as well that we can play with here. But what I'm going to do here and just show you an example of a policy. So let's have a quick look. So this is a policy, a rate limit policy. So I'm going to this set of policies is, and we talked. This comes back. Sorry. So this comes back to what we talked around earlier. So if I just pull this diagram up here, so we've got inbound, we've got back end, and then we've got outbound, and that's pretty much what's happening here. So you can hook into the part of the request lifecycle that you're interested in. So if you do inbound, it's going to be as soon as that thing comes in. So you might want to log some stuff, do some authentication, whatever it is you're interested in to do first. And then the back end is more to do with, okay, so it's gone through its validation, we know where it's going to go. You might want to do some routing to your back end services, and that might be dynamic. So I don't know, you might have a set of very slim microservices on the back end, and some you might want to reroute to those, but you're actually exposing a more a less granular kind of set of APIs on the front end and talking to more granular services on the back end. Anyway, so that's the sort of thing you can do there. And outbound is basically the response. So when it comes back through the pipeline, you've also got some options there. I haven't got a login example on this demo, but there is quite a nice kind of login feature where you can just hook out to, and you can use a policy to do it, and then you can log out from each of these points. So you can say, okay, this was the inbound log, this is the outbound log. You can log the payload and the URL, and then push that out and just emit those to event service bus or event, like an event source. Sorry, I've completely forgot the service name. But yeah, so you can effectively output very high throughput messages, which are logs, and then capture those somewhere else and persist them like batch or periodically. It's quite powerful because if you imagine you've got an API perimeter, and then I don't know, all your customers are going through that, or your partners, all that information actually gets sourced through one place, and the analytics around that information, if you store that, is actually pretty interesting. You get quite a lot of information, you get quite a lot of bang for your buck just routing everything through one place, and no code, so you don't have to worry about if you want to make changes to your login strategies, whatever, and security. So I'm just going to add a policy here, and this is a rate limit policy. So basically, what we're saying here is on my free policy, product level, I'm going to put a policy to say, I'm just in these because I know they're not right, but yeah, so I'm basically on inbound, I'm going to do a rate limit, and so it's going to say for that given subscriber, I can't do more than 10 calls within 60 seconds. So that's basically a little bit of a rule to say, you know, I'll give you this for free, but you know, if you want more, then go and pay for the more expensive. No, I can't find my save button. There it is. Okay, so so now we've got that. We should sort of see some restrictions now. So we've got a little bit of protection on our free product where, I don't know, if I go crazy on here now, we should start to see some errors come through. There you go. So we've got a 429. Your rate limit's exceeded on that request. Yeah, and that's the sort of thing. And that, even that alone is quite powerful, I'd say, for setting up these different sort of rates. And you can do that. You can do that at subscription level as well. So if there's a particular user you're trying to rate limit, or you know, you can do it by product, obviously, and globally. But if you want to go down to a subscription level and put the ID in a subscriber to rate limit those, you can do that. But by default, it works against the subscriber, if that makes sense. So across the board. So for that product, for a given subscriber, they can call this service 10 times every second, every minute. I don't know if I've been talking for a minute, so we'll see. We'll come back to that in a second. Yeah, and you get the idea. I've got another example here where I could put 1,000 per second on my full product, but I won't do that for now because I think you probably get that. Okay. The other thing that's quite interesting and quite useful, so I'll show you another policy which, so one of the things I think is quite interesting for like API gateway is that it takes a lot of the, you know, developers generally have quite a lot to think about, and it's easy to make a mistake or miss something out. And if you've got quite strict, some companies have quite strict security policies around, you know, how they, what they expose to their partners and all the rest of it. So API gateway management helps you kind of take that responsibility away from the developer. And so this is a good example of that, where we've got the ability now to, so if we look at, sorry, if we just look at the response, see if I've been talking for a minute, there we go. So we've got a response come back. Oh, you know what? I don't think I took it out of my last last time I did the demo. I'll tell you what, I'll take it out and I'll show you what it looks like if I take the policy out. So if to set something at a global level, you can just click on the all APIs. Yeah, okay. So I left this in there from the last demo, but basically, actually let's look at the XML because it's a bit more descriptive. So I've got, this is my header. So basically I've just removed the X powered by header in here, so that basically anytime anyone goes through the API gateway, I've stripped off that header. Now you can put wildcards and all sorts in here to prevent any kind of response coming back. Now there's obviously a few that you do want. But when it comes to giving away what your backend services are, some people would consider that a security issue because you're exposing your implementation, and that gives someone an in to potentially hack you. So putting this in prevents at least that one header to be returned. If I take that out now and then go run this thing again, you can see it's not there now. Yeah, so it's coming back in. So yeah, that's again, that comes back to taking some of the responsibility away from the developer. They can focus on the logic and the application. And then I feel like API management sits somewhere between infrastructure and application. There's some kind of responsibilities that don't really fit in the application, but don't really fit in infrastructure necessarily. So yeah, it's a nice place to be able to apply some of those things for the purpose of exposing services. Okay. So that's a couple of policy examples. I'll go on to next. I'll just have a little look at revisions. So, so we've got an application. We have, what shall I do here? Yeah, let's create a new revision. So we've got our API. We've got version 1. I'm not going to create a new version because the version is effectively a snapshot of an existing version. It's effectively like a new API. I could snapshot this now and create a new version, but it would really just be the same as the other one. In order to access it, the main difference would be the URL would be 2 because I've chosen the path scheme. So you can DNS this, but currently my endpoints are listening on this endpoint. I've got an API here, but this particular service is listening on V1 API consultants. So yeah, so you can change your versions and endpoint names. But I'm going to do a revision. Sorry. So revisions are good for being able to take your existing version. You've got a minor tweak, and generally the way we build out our services, we kind of work additively. So we don't take away. If we have to take away, then we probably start thinking about a new version, or putting it out there that it's soon to be revoked. But the general approach that we would take is we would put a slim. Our general approach is we would put a slim service out with, you know, like the minimal number of methods needed to do the job, and then the minimal number of fields on the responses to give them the information needed, and the minimum number of parameters on the request. So everything's into a minimum, and then if we need something else, then the task is an add, and an add is less likely to break a consumer. If you start to change names of things, or if you start to delete things, then that's when you start to see some issues, and that's where you might want to think about changing to a new version. But if I add a revision, so we can see on this current API, so there's all APIs here, I've got basically my revision, and it defaults you here. It's not that noticeable initially until you start thinking about revisions, but we've got this revision at the top. Everything in here around the policies, everything that we've just talked about is in the scope of a revision. If I change that, it kind of copies what you've got already. So I'm going to do I'm going to add a new method to get let's get the highest ranked consultant. I don't know how we're scoring this. Okay, so now basically we've taken a copy of what we had before. It's actually the same, you know, it's working on the same base, but it's going to apply some delta, some change. And so what we can start doing now is making some changes to the methods. So I've got a number of methods here. I'm going to add a new operation, and it's put me, as soon as you create a new revision, it puts you in the into the new revision on this window. You can go back to the other one if you click on this one and select that one. But I'm going to stick here for a minute because I want to create a couple of bits. Let's just create. I'm going to create highest ranked, yeah, and then we'll give it. And then I'm going to create. Yeah, this is its path, and where we want the highest ranked consultants. Okay, I'm just going to save that for a second and come back in here. So yeah, we've got a new method now, but it's not actually doing anything. If I try and call that, it'll throw an error because there's nothing listening on the back end. There's nothing you know, described for that service. So what we're going to do is we're going to use another feature, which is the mock feature. The mock is quite useful for providing well, mocks. So it's good. I've been in a few scenarios where you've implemented a system. There's two systems working together. One's production. You've just deployed yours, and you know, you're talking to an endpoint on the API management. The management gives you that layer of insulation, or that, you know, that ability to switch and change. You know, what's sitting behind your gateway, or you can put out something called a mock, which is effectively, if you're building a product and the development team on the front end are ahead of you and they need some access to the APIs that you haven't quite got ready yet, you can put out mocks to represent information that you want to come back from the gateway. So you might want to, you know, mock out the specific JSON or whatever it is, and then you get to sort of move quickly and then implement it later and switch back. So that's the general idea. So we've got this endpoint. going to go in here and create a response, and it'll be for a 200 response, and I'll just do highly ranked as a description. Yeah, and then we're basically saying, well, if there's a 200 response and we call this, and that's what we want to return, we need to have a representation, which is basically we want some JSON, and then you can basically say what do you want to return, like what are you interested in returning. This is a mock, so we're just going to return some stuff. We're not going to go back to a back end. We're just going to give you a payload. So I'm just going to put in that there. Okay. So that's giving you an option for a response from that service, and we haven't set up the actual mock yet, so we can do that here. So let's do this through the graphic one. There's a mock responses down here. So I can come in there, and then I can, let's spell that off. That should be highly ranked. That's highly ranged, just use that. So we've just set up a mock there. So we've got a service, so we've just added manually a method. It doesn't exist on the back end. And then we've just gone to represent what, if you called that endpoint now, what were you going to get back? And then we've just described that as this JSON. So we can go into, well, actually, if we go into the dev portal, you'll actually see that it shouldn't be available yet because it's not part of our current revision. So we've made a change. I'm in my portal and I can't see get me the highly skilled consultants. So we can go back into into my API, into my revisions. So yeah, so this is what I've just added, and then I can make that the current version. And then this is like a change log, which will show up on the portal to say, actually, this is a new revision. These are the changes. Added mock. So that version or that revision of the endpoint is now available. So if I come back in here, should be able to see that I've got another endpoint. Yeah, so I've got this highly ranked endpoint, and everything we do against that now is going to come back from a yeah, so we should just be able to run that, and then you can see I've got an endpoint. I haven't got it ready yet, but I'm just like working with my front end dev team, for example. So it's quite a nice feature, and just calls out like you've got something in the middle, so you've got options if you need them. Yeah. Okay, so that is the revisions. What I wanted to talk about a little bit next was there's other things that I think are quite important when it comes to APIs. One is security. So we're just going to hook up a little bit around OAuth 2. And then the other thing we've got is just around caching. So how we can help through configuration, cache requests and response. So I'm going to do a deployment here. And while I do this, we can talk about security. So I'll just, okay, so I'm gonna expose this new method on my in my code. So basically, I haven't got this at the moment, but I've got a new endpoint that's called all skills. I'm just putting a 5-second sleep just to show you the variance. So let's just whack this into sorry, don't. Okay, and then we'll push that up. Yeah, okay. So while that's doing that, I'll show you the caching last. So what I'll do while that's building, I will show you something else, which is, I'm just going to talk a little bit about OAuth. So I've just stood up a very simple OAuth endpoint. We use Identity Server for a lot of our security, but basically it's just a running, however you want to host it, web app, .NET Core application that is responsible for issuing tokens. So it implements OpenID and it implements OAuth 2. gives you identity and access tokens. Now I've configured up this service. So basically, to create a new one of these on the portal, just come into OAuth, create a new one here, and then this is then available to you as a validation or an issuing service within the portal. And what we want to do is protect our endpoint now from with some authentication. So I've configured this, but basically this is my client secret, my client ID, and the scope that I'm interested in. So that's all just standard OAuth implementation. So given that I've got that available, I now can mark my API as wanting to use that. I go into my, sorry, it's just really small. There we go. So what I've done here is just come into my specific version of an API, and I'm going to say that I want to do some apply some security to this API, or to be able to utilize an endpoint, more importantly. So we're not protecting it at this point. We're just saying if I'm in the portal, there is this configured effectively client that talks out to my identity server. So that client provides the secret and everything that I need in order to get an access token. So it's more for convenience than anything. So we'll save that down. And now when we're in the, I can show you inside the portal, it doesn't actually protect it. It just gives you the option to use it. So then my highest ranked is still there. And then I've got this new option. So I can apply, I've configured this client to use the OAuth client credentials. And then it's basically put in an authentication token in the header, which is standard, bearer token stuff. So that's going to go in the HTTP header. It doesn't matter if I've actually got that or not. Oh, yeah, sometimes it takes a subscription key out for some reason. Yeah, so we always want to pass a subscription key. So it's going to work, but it's actually going to work whether we use that or not at the moment. So I've got, so I can get my list of consultants, and then I'll try that. And I'm not going to pass in any kind of authentication. I'll just send it, and it shouldn't really make a difference because we haven't applied a policy to say check the validation. So that's what I do now. So I'll just go over and so we can put this at different levels. We can put it at the global level. I'm just going to put it as a policy on the on here. So I've got an inbound. I don't know if I mentioned earlier, but each one of these, you see the base, that's just standard inheritance. So the rules that are applied at the high level in the hierarchy. So, you've got APIs under products, products under global. If you set something at a global level, it will sort of filter down to everything. And then you can either do your thing before the inherited behavior, or you can do it after, or take it out if you want to override it completely. Yeah, so I'm just going to grab a policy configuration specific. So this is basically, so this is the policy that you need to inject to say, okay, in order to use this API, you now have to have an authentication access token. And so it's going to use the well-known OpenID configuration endpoint on that API, on my identity server. And then if it fails validation, I'm just going to do a 401. Sorry. Okay, so I've got validate drop token there. So if I come back into here now, so that endpoint I just ran without any authentication, now comes back with a 401 because I haven't got a drop token. I didn't validate, it's not come through and validated, so I've thrown back a 401. And now if I use client credentials, so what this is going to do just through the portal implementation is just going to take that configured client ID secret, go off, talk to, do a post up to my identity endpoint on the authorized endpoint, and get a token back, so an access token back from that endpoint. And then I can use that access token to get information. So now I've got my backend service. I've rate limited all of those services for my free product. I've done a little bit of mocking to help the front end dev team. and then now we've just protected it with our OAuth. So obviously that client flow is just for the portal. You would implement a different OAuth flow for your, I don't know, SPA application. If you wanted to use that, maybe use like a resource owner flow where the users also put in their username and password and generating access tokens. But that's all configurable, and you would just apply that onto the job validation, and you should be good to go. Let's just see how we get on with our build. I'll just see if that new application has gone up. If it has, I'll update the updated. Okay, so I've got this add skills here. I'm just gonna import this, and we'll lose that. Let's create another version maybe. Sorry, clicking around. Right, so I'll create a new revision. Okay, let's call it added slow method. So this one is the one that I put the sleep on. So we just did that deployment, and I put a new method up, which was get all skills. Yeah. So I want to come in here now, based on this revision 3, and I do a I lost my, sorry. Yeah, so I do an import on there. Boop, boop. Okay, so I'm going to do an update on this one. And I think I preserve my policies, but I'm going to do an update. Okay, so now I've got available. I think it was all skills was my new one. So that's my slow. So I've just done an update. I've got this one here. I'm just going to make this one current. Okay. So yeah, I've got a new revision. It's got my new endpoint on it that I've just imported. And just to prove that one is not great, we'll go up to that's the portal. So I should still be protected. So this get all skills is the one I just added. Yeah, I'll put some credentials on that. So this has got a 5-second delay on it, so it might be a heavy endpoint to get some information. Obviously, it's not that, but every time I click this, there's a sleep in there representing some kind of work that would need to happen. So if it's slow moving data, I might be okay, and there's lots of information and there's lots of requests to it. You know, sometimes it's quite useful even to give yourself 5 seconds or 10 seconds as a cached. You know, anytime you receive information, it's kind of invalid unless you're constantly pulling it down. You can always assume it's out of date at some point. So adding a small cache, even on the API, is quite useful. It's unlikely to have changed since the last time you retrieved it. So what I'm going to do is put just a little bit of a caching policy on that one method. So we're going to go down to the method level and just say, actually, I know that's a slow request. It's quite expensive on the back end. It's causing me some problems. So I'm going to just protect that up a little bit. So that we do that through adding actually 2 policy statements. So we're going to come in here. So the first thing we want to do is on the request in, we're just going to do what's known as a cache lookup. here. And then we'll vary it by these two header keys. So basically, if you wanted to get the information in a different format, it wouldn't reuse the cache. And then we're going to, on the way out, basically, so we're going to do a request on the way in, which is going to say, is there something in the cache? If there is, then we're just going to return with that response. And then if there's not, then we're going to go out to the back end. But then on the way back through, we're going to pop it back in the cache to make sure that we've got it. And so now that endpoint, all skills, is effectively protected from a cat. Well, sorry, we've got a little bit of caching in there. So hopefully now we should see the first hit. So we're still going to see a 5-second hit the first time we go there. But then subsequent requests are not, that's not working, is it? Subsequent requests should be quicker. Did I say that? All skills, can I go to all skills? Okay, let's just come out there and go back in. Okay, that's 5 seconds, and that's not taken that for some reason. Outbound, club inbound. Did I make that my current revision? Oh, it's because I put it on revision 2. So let's just go back out. If that doesn't work, we'll move on. So first one should be 5, and then the second one, there you go. Is resource not found. That's because I haven't got that endpoint on that vision. Okay. Let's just go and put that current. Sorry, got messed up with my revisions there. Okay, I'm going to pop that back on. Just to prove it. Let's see, it's there on that revision. 3. Current. All right, I'll try this again. If not, I won't sit in front of you messing up my my revisions. Okay. Oh, not taken. I know what I've done there. Yeah, it's still taking. It's definitely not applying the cache, so I don't know what's going on there. Okay. Oh, okay. There you go. Yeah, on that revision, I've got that one. Okay, this is going to be the last time I'll try it for us. Oy, oy, oy. Yeah. Oh, okay. I won't mess around much longer. In fact, that's taken me to the end anyway, so it's going to bug me now. Yeah, okay. So it took me down to the end anyway. I just wanted to do the caching piece at the end because it's quite a nice little feature, but I'm obviously struggling with something there. So yeah, I guess we'll finish that. And if you've got any questions, I'll open it up to the floor and talk about any other pieces we've got going on. But yeah, that's me done. Back over to you, Mashek, I guess.
Thanks, Noel. I think there was some sort of confusion when it comes to the actual start of the webinar. I think because I originally posted the meetup on the local Polish group, and then I posted it on some other UK groups, and this is most likely where it stems from. So I hope we can, for you guys who just joined late or didn't have a chance to join at all, I hope we can share the recording. I'll be able to send you the link, hopefully. I think we will be able to do it afterwards. So sorry about this again.
That's all right, no worries. I think I'll get this working as well, and then we'll append on the cache that did work. That's very frustrating. And I've got unstable internet. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so unless there's any questions, I guess that's we'll call it a day there. More than happy to answer anything. Any questions in the sorry, I'm just looking through the chat. Okay, cool. I can't see any specific questions.
Yeah, I've got some questions.
Okay.
So I started to integrate 2 existing APIs into the API management recently. And one of these APIs, it contains the basically identity server with all these, connect token endpoints and so on. So what I basically did is I have my identity server behind API management. It works, but I wonder, do you know if there's some limitations, or would you recommend to put it in front of API management? Because as I understand correctly, in your example, there is no authentication and authorization on the application side.
Yeah, so yeah, that's a good point. So yeah, I've explicitly not validated my dot token internally because, well, we've implemented that in a couple of ways actually. So we've done double validation. So we have protected it at the API level as well as the gateway. So, so sometimes it does add performance. It depends on what you're trying to do, I guess. But we've certainly done that because we had different scopes at different levels. So certain APIs, you might have different things. So you might want to do like a perimeter check, just a very simple validation on the outside perimeter technology. But then also, with the microservice world, you might be using different protocols and a whole host of different things internally. So would you necessarily use OAuth for all your internal integration, like communications? Maybe not. Maybe a simpler kind of token-based authentication. That seems to be what we're talking about more with clients, is actually whatever's on the inside doesn't necessarily have to be on the outside, because we've protected it with a very standards-based OAuth implementation outside. But that's not always as performant as something on the inside. So yeah, I think it depends. And also there is the need to protect, and you might want to use something a bit like front door on your identity server as well, because someone could hit that. And there's, like a front door is more of an infrastructure lightweight version of API management that I think would be nice to sit in front of your identity server. But I think it's horses for courses, to be honest. I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer, but we have validated on both. Like we've done a broader scope validation on the perimeter, and then a more specific, actually, because you can get into role-based stuff as well, can't you? Around you might have different scopes to read and write.
And by claims, can you like do authorization on by claims on the API management level?
Yeah, you can do. Yeah, you can do that.
Yeah,
you can check for different scopes. It's actually quite powerful. Those policies, you can do most things. There's not. I guess it's just a way up as to how much you put at the different areas. Because if it gets too cloggy on the API management or the gateway, I think that becomes a bit of a risk. So if you start to put too much logic, it's a bit like the old, in my mind, a bit like the old service bus implementation where you're tying up all these services and you end up with this actual business logic in the integration. So I try and keep it as light as possible on gateway and just keep it, like pull myself back and say, actually, do I need to put this logic on traffic? Effectively, what is quite a clever traffic manager, and think about that. But yeah, so I keep the validation quite light and don't get too invested in tokens on the perimeter.
Yeah, okay. Right now I've got it like
yeah.
behind in one of the app
Yeah.
services. And the only problem was that I wanted to actually expose the identity server endpoints to the API management, so I can import it with the definition. And I needed to add it manually, like by hand.
Right.
I wasn't able to make Swagger to list the identity server endpoints. I don't know why, but I added it manually.
Okay. Actually, the portal doesn't like the latest version of Swagger. So if you've got OpenID 3, I think it'll blows up. But if you go down to 2, it works.
Okay, I got 3.
Yeah. Yeah. I had to come down to 3. That's what Swagger does support 3, and I had to come down to 2 to get it to import. Yeah.
I wrote it down. Okay, so another question. When it comes to the subscription key, so in my case, I want to like expose my API to some other developers out there.
Yep.
So by subscription key, but there's also going to be like a publicly available SPA application that is also going to say to use the same API.
Yep.
And the question is, when there is like a subscription key available in this SPA application, then someone can just take this subscription key and use it like without the SPA, which I don't want. And is there a way to protect it?
Personally, I don't think of a subscription key as any kind of protection. So I think of it as it's really just a user identifier, and which is why I use authentication. Which is why I always put OAuth on the perimeter, because it's really because you're going to see that in the header, and people could whip that out.
That's right. But for example, I wanted to use it for throttling, so to like limit the access to the API. So it's not really authentication, but still, it's kind of important that people don't have my subscription key that is used in the SPA, and I'm looking for some way of protection. Yeah,
I think you could. Well, I think when it comes down to using SPAs or clients, it's very difficult, and that's the whole reason you use the authorization codes flow with PKE CE for those types of clients. That's what I would use for protection, and it's almost, if you're providing a subscription key, you kind of lose the worth if you've got that being called from. If you're calling it directly from a client, all you really know is, okay, so someone's using that who's on behalf of my app or whatever it is. So it's kind of out there anyway, and it's difficult. I would say it's difficult to manage. You probably see you've probably seen the analytics. You can see where requests are coming from, and you can start to see spikes in potential even individual IP addresses that you can sort of blacklist if you did see those come through. But I wouldn't trust the subscription key personally. I just would use a flow that's more appropriate to hide in any kind of secret in any kind of client.
Yeah, sure.
And use it as a tracker more than anything else. That's personally what I would do with it. Yeah. Because otherwise you're coming back to the same problem that OAuth tries to solve, which is do it through some challenge and transition between trusted identity and something else. And I don't really know much any other way really of doing that if you're exposing a secret inside of a client that's available, like in JavaScript, for example.
Okay,
sorry,
last question.
I don't know.
Just last one. So I assume if we have the API management and maybe some other application services, it should be in some kind of a virtual network. Do you use this approach, or are your APIs like available publicly, like without API management?
So I tend to whitelist IPs. So it depends how much, I was talking about this earlier, it depends how much money you want to spend. So if you want to, I know some options around hiding your app services, for example, quite expensive. If you start going down to the service environment route, it gets a bit pricey. I haven't looked at it for a while, so that may have changed, to be fair. But I tend to, if I set up APIs on just simple APIs on app services like this one, I would use the IP and firewall to restrict traffic only.
But do you know which IP the API management is using?
Yeah, so if you go to the gateway, this virtual IP address here is the one that will call down to your service. So you should be able to use that.
Where's it? Where's it?
It's on. If you go to your API management overview, it's on the top screen there. That IP address there.
Overview. I'm here.
Yeah. So you see public IP there. So it's a virtual VIP.
Yeah, I can see it, but it's probably because right now I'm on the consumption tier. Maybe it's available in the developer tier.
Oh, yeah, could well be. Actually, it is. I think it only comes with standard. So if you're on basic, it's with developer because they tease you. But the standard is much cheaper still than. Yeah, sorry, that is true. You don't get the static IP with a very basic subscription. But when you move to standard, you'll get that, and I think that's like $500 or $600.
Okay, so it's
a bit cheaper than it used to be.
Okay, so it's on the standard. I will check it, but okay, but that was the part that I was missing. Like, do I have to have a virtual network, or can I just okay?
Yeah. There's some tips and tricks to use that, but I would go IP whitelisting and then use the standard version of API management. Yeah.
Good, thank you. That was very kind of you and useful for me. Thanks.
Good. Thank you. Happy to answer anything else. I don't know. I didn't expect to take up nearly 2 hours. Sorry about that. I did waffle on a bit. Ashik, are there any questions that you've picked out of the messages, or are we good?
Yeah, no more questions, I guess.
Awesome. Okay.
Yeah, we can call it a day. Thanks, Noel. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Have a great evening, and hopefully you'll attend another one soon. We're planning to have another webinar at the end of May, so in a month's time. I'll send you invites, obviously, once the topic is confirmed. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Masha. Cheers, guys. Stay safe.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.